Dear students, good morning. This is the class for May the 5th, 2020 for Asia e Africa 1. Okay, so let's go to what we were doing yesterday. Okay, so I told you that I'm going to prepare the video, that video about how, what you have to do for your exams. Since I'm recording this on Saturday, I will probably prepare that video tomorrow. So if you have any questions about that, just write a comment in the comment box or send me an email. Okay, so let's go back to what we were doing on Monday, and we're talking about the ELF process, the English as a lingua franca. Okay, and we looked at how English as a lingua franca is definitely a process of simplification of English. Okay, so for instance, it does not use the S of present tense, or in some cases it marks the S of the plural, the mark of S as a plural form, where it is not supposed to be in English from the inner circle. And we were talking about some scholars that make a difference between native and non-native speakers of English. Okay? The fact is that when English is used as an international lingua franca, speakers own that lingua franca, because there are no native speakers of a lingua franca, as well as there aren't any non-native speakers of a lingua franca. Okay. So this idea of speaking of native versus non-native English speakers of a lingua franca promotes the idea of English as belonging to an ethnic group, and that it has to be similar or as close as possible to the language used by that ethnic group. However, Jenkins prefers another categorization, and we looked at the differences between monolingual English speaker, so somebody who only speaks English, or bilingual, bilingual English speakers, meaning that they are proficient in English and in another language, and non-bilingual English speakers, meaning people who are not proficient in English. Well, they're not proficient, but at least they have a reasonable competence in English, and they have another mother tongue language. So we finished off that class looking at the idea of some scholars who speak of a second language acquisition, that consider all these varieties of English not varieties of English, but as interlanguages, meaning a language that is just made up of mistakes. Okay? Because the goal of second language acquisition is to sound like a native speaker. And so whatever does not match with how English is used in the inner circle is just a mistake, according to these scholars. And so the idea that is behind this is that English is used with the aim of integration. So I learn a language because I want to become part of that culture. But in indigenous varieties of English, meaning different varieties of English, there is a totally different setting. We said that these people do not communicate usually with native speakers, but with other non-native speakers. Plus, they learn English from somebody who is probably not going to be a native speaker. And these Englishes are used in multilingual settings, and they all give a contribution to how English is spoken. And the ultimate thing is that the motivation for speaking English is instrumental, meaning that these people need to communicate. They don't want to become part of the English inner circle communities. They needed to communicate. So we looked at this debate between this dilemma, this dilemma between people who want to respect their local needs through their language, but at the same time they want to be understood by people who do not belong to the local community. Okay, so there's this push and pull factors that influence their language and the debates and linguistics about it. We looked at the case of Asian Englishes, okay, and how these varieties of English are characterized by lots of code mixing. Okay, so yes, there are words in English, but there's also words from their local languages, and this makes it difficult to understand them at an international level. Okay, we did this exercise together. And so this last part of the book includes a debate on convergence or divergence, meaning, do you think that all these varieties are going to look alike, or are they going to be different? And we looked at several perspectives, several facts that can happen nowadays with children, for instance, born from parents who have English as a foreign language, and it's a language that they use to communicate between each other. And so Crystal prefers to use world standard spoken English, okay? And according to him, let's say that when English is used at an international level, they tend to converge towards American English because of the media, because of songs and other things. But and conversely, when English is used at a local level, these tend to become increasingly divergent. Okay, they tend to gain features that belong to the local language. And that's more or less what what we did yesterday was about. Now, let's go forward. To section C, current debates in global Englishes. More specifically, today we're going to talk about post-colonial African and North American varieties of English. So as you can see, your book gives you the theoretical part in part A, then it gives you some debates in part B, and then it gets a little deeper into these topics in part C. That's why you see that there are some things that are going to be repetitive. And so this first part is going to be about the English-only movement in the United States. Before we get into what this means, let's look at some data. According to a US census of 1990, 62 million people out of a population of 251 million people were visibly belonged to ethno-linguistic minority groups. This means that you could understand by looking at them and listening to what they said that they were part of a minority group. 62 million out of 250 million. That is a lot. The main groups were African, 31 million, so most part of the community. Latin American, and that included all Latino minorities with 22 million people. And then less people, but still very significant level of Asian people, 7 million. And then a final 2 million that included Aboriginal and other minorities. That's 1990. Now, let's go to 2010s. So let's look at what happened about 20 years after. 20 years later, sorry. Okay, so they are here. That's 1990, 2010. So what happens 10 years afterwards? Well, in this case, then Africans got up to 39 million, with 12.6%. Hispanics, or Latino, went to 16.3%. Asians, 4.8%. American Indians and Alaskan Natives, about 0.9%. Okay, so this is the difference. And as you can see, there was a raise and increase in Hispanic people of a Hispanic or Latino origin. Regardless of the percentages, this has led to some English-only movements and to the concept of US English or official English. And it's not something that is recent. Okay, it already started in the late 19th century when lots of people from Southern Europe began to migrate to the United States. And the idea is basically this. We have room, but for one language here, and that is the English language. For we intend to see that the crucible turns our people out as Americans, our American nationality, and not as dwellers in a polyglot boarding house. Okay? So already then there was this birth of an English-only movement that was clearly against immigration. And so that was the first race, the first movement. What happened in the 1920s? Well, in the United States, there were lots of policies that went against minorities. One example for all is the case of Native Indian children that were kidnapped from their reservations, and they were forced to live in boarding schools. So with this very harsh and inhumane behavior, these kids were brought to these boarding schools, forced to learn English, following, let's say, a military type of life. And for those kids who even tried to run away, they would be caught by their same Indian agents and returned to school. So during this moment, there was not only, let's say, social discrimination, but also discrimination against language, against the culture, basically. Okay? When these children were forced to learn English. Fast forward to the world after World War II, and leaping forward toward the 1960s, 1968 actually. And there's this new act, the Bilingual Education Act, according to which subjects were to be available in the immigrants' native languages. But this idea was born because of the context, because in the 1960s, lots of people got to the United States from developing countries. And this led to further phenomena of xenophobia and to the race of English only, of the English only movement. And I would add here that, let's say, in the late 1980s, in the United States, whoever had a non-American background was supposed or highly invited, or at least inserted, in English as a second language classes. This meant that for an hour or two every week, children who were not 100% American had to attend these immersion courses on language, on culture, and these classes brought together whatever minorities, whatever types of migrants were in a class. Okay, I remember that I attended classes with Chinese people, or with Chinese children, with Saudi Arabian children. I don't have lots of memories about these classes, but even if we were highly proficient in English, we still had to attend these classes anyway. And then we get to the almost the end of the 1990s, with 1998, where there was this program, the English Language Education for Children in Public Schools Initiative, according to which all children who were who did not have English as their first first language had to first participate in immersion programs for 1 year, okay, every day, and then they could access mainstream education. So it was a sort of preparation to attending a school that was 100% English. Now, as for this activity, I want to read with you some accounts, some brief explanations of bilingual students. And more specifically, they are Asian American college students that attended the University of California in Berkeley. They're anonymous, but we know their age more or less. So, at the age of 10, my family, on my mother's side, immigrated to America. And this is where I learned my second language. Going to school made me feel deaf, mute, and blind. I could understand nothing that was going on around me. I didn't have any friends at all because nobody spoke Chinese. How I longed to go back to Taiwan and to see familiar faces and to hear my native language being spoken. It was two heartless comments from a group of small boys in my white neighborhood. For me to want to deny my language, let alone my culture as well. How was I to react to a racist comment on Ching Chong Chuni, go back home to where you belong? You can't even speak English right. 16 small words which possessed so much strength and contained so much power caused a small naive child to lose her heritage, to lose what made her. I know that I have been extremely fortunate to have been able to learn English so easily, but I have paid a dear price in exchange. I began my English education with the basics, starting in first grade. As a result, I had to end my Chinese education at that time. I have forsaken my own language in order to become American. I no longer read or write Chinese. I am ashamed and feel as if I am a statistic adding a burden and lowering the status quo of the Asian community as an illiterate of the Chinese language. When some of my classmates began to ridicule and throw racist remarks at Chinese people, I began to distance myself away from Chinese culture. I felt ashamed when my parents spoke to me in Cantonese at a supermarket. I got into heated arguments about why only English should be spoken at home. I continuously tried to fit in, even if it meant abandoning culture and identity. I was probably most hostile to my background during those years in junior high. The loss of one's culture language symbolized the loss of one's cultural identity. Many Asian Americans pride themselves for successfully turning their kids into complete Americans who speak English in flawless American accent. In my perspective, this actually is something that they should be ashamed of. Without doubt, fitting oneself into the mainstream is important. Yet, remaining one's cultural language is not at all trivial. To me, I will try my best to excel both in English and my mother tongue, Cantonese. So these six excerpts, these six statements from six different kids who did not have English as their mother tongue, um, definitely make us think about the English-only movement. But I ask you to give me a brief comment about what you think about the English-only movement. What are the pros and what are the cons? And what other factors do you think could be involved in how these kids felt? Sorry. Going to more recent years, after the 2000s, one of the programs that has been implemented, is the No Child Left Behind Act, the NCLB, that targets language minority students. They try to reinforce their language, the English language, their usage of English language, and integrate them in the American culture. The purpose seems to be a good one, so that these children do not feel lost, just like one of the cases that we read about seems to point at. But at the same time, there is a link between funds that go to schools and the levels of proficiency, of fluency that these children obtain in English language. Okay? So it looks like something that is cute for kids, but it's actually all about money, about funding. As a matter of fact, the scholar Crawford nicknamed this movement, this act, as the No Child Left Bilingual Act. Because, according to Crawford, this is actually wanting to get rid of the language and cultural heritage of immigrants, and trying to favor a new English-only movement, even if they're not calling it English-only movement. That was 2002. But now I want you to pause the video here and watch this video. And it's called Powerful White Nationalists Behind the English-Only Movement. This video will tell you something more about the policies that are now used in the United States and what is behind them. Okay, so pause the video now and see you back in 14 minutes. Okay, so we're back with that. I know that the video has lots of names and lots of politicians, but I just want you to focus on the main idea. Some of the main ideas, and I'll give you a guide for that, are that you always have to consider that English is not the US's, it's not the official language of the United States, okay? So all those people who are claiming you are in the United States, you have to speak English, English is the language of the United States, are actually saying something that is incorrect, at least technically. As you can clearly get that what is behind these movements is a clearly anti-immigration movement, almost all of the times. Okay. Now think about the quote. I don't remember the name of the politician, but whoever said, "You can't build civilization with somebody else's babies." As you can see, there's a birth rate policy, a language policy, a cultural policy that is all going towards English as the only pure language that should be spoken in the United States. And the video goes a little further by comparing these movements with what was basically Nazism. So, second topic, we'll start this one and we'll continue it during our next class. Some questions about the status quo of English in Africa. We said that African English includes several different types of English, like the one spoken in West Africa, East Africa, or South Africa. Okay. And so there's an ongoing debate about whether these populations should use their own standards, own language standards, endonormative, or if they should continue looking outside, looking at the inner circle, more specifically to British English for standards, and so exonormative, meaning should these varieties of English look for their own standards, or should they always look at Great Britain for language standards? And so, lots of scholars have tried to understand whether using English promotes the interests of the inner circle at the expense of the outer circles. So who can take advantage and who is taken advantage of? So there's this scholar that tried to answer a couple of questions that have been quite commonly asked in these recent years from a language point of view. And so he analyzed the evolution of the usage of English in Africa. One of the first questions that usually scholars ask themselves is, has English succeeded in displacing or replacing other languages in Nigeria? And the answer to this question is no. Because English is used in these contexts to satisfy a series of functions in a society that is full of several varieties of several languages. It's a multilingual and multicultural society. But there's a change. There's been a change. Nowadays, the attitude towards English in Africa is not the same as it used to be in the colonial times. These populations do not define themselves as victims of linguistic imperialism. It's as if English has become their language. Let's look at point number 2. Has the dominance of English caused the Nigerian culture to be undervalued and marginalized? The scholar's answer to this question is no, because Nigeria is a multicultural society, okay? And English is just one of the cultures that have become part of the consciousness of the Nigerian people. So just one among many other. And another question is, why did some African writers that were literate and fluent in their mother tongues write in English? And Bison replied, well, English is just one of the languages that were available to them. It was a multicultural, multilingual society, and so it's just their choice. And Philipson decided to respond to these theories with 4 main ideas. He says, no, I totally disagree with what you are saying. Reality is slightly different in Africa. According to Philipson, actually, it is not what Bisang says is not correct, because he says that African languages are more and more marginalized in favor of English. So it's just not one choice among many others. It's that it was imposed. Plus, all the local governments, or most local governments, promote English over local languages because they want to build up a sense of nationhood. They want to put aside ethnicities, the several ethnicities of Africa, to build up the idea of a nation. And how do you do that? Through language first. And he also analyzes what Bison said about literature. And Phillips notices that 90% of the African population does not speak English. And so they cannot read literature in English. He says that it's not correct that whatever the other scholars said about literature in English is not correct, meaning it's just not a personal choice, but that writing in English in Africa is a form of elitism. And we'll pick up from here. No. So just 2 questions for you, and then we'll stop. So Bison claims no nation can escape its history. Do you agree? And then these other 2 scholars ask, if you were asked to advise a sub-Saharan African government on the selection of a national language, would you recommend an African language of a wider communication or a European language? Okay. So if you want to add a comment to some of these questions that we've looked at during this class, just write something in the comment box. So what did we do today? We started section C. We were looking at post-colonial Africa and North America. We talked about the English-only movement in the United States and how this English-only movement has evolved from the 19th century to nowadays. Basically, okay, going through the 1920s and the 1970s. I gave you something about the late 1980s and 1990s and to what is going on today. We analyzed some experiences of some Asian American students and how they experienced their transition from their local language to English at school. We talked about the No Child Left Behind Act, that is one of the most recent, and what is behind the idea of the English-only movement nowadays. Finally, I introduced this debate on African Englishes and whether they should use their own standards or they should always keep looking at Great Britain for their standards from a linguistic point of view. And we looked at some ideas, some scholars that have totally opposite ideas about how English is used specifically in Nigeria. Okay, and so we can stop right here and we'll continue next week. So today's song is Light My Fire, The Doors. You know that it would be untrue. You know that I would be a liar. If I were to say to you, girl, we couldn't get much higher. Come on, baby, light my fire. Try to set the night on fire. The time to hesitate is through. No time to wallow in the mire. Try now, we can only lose, and our love become a funeral pyre. Come on, baby, light my fire. Oh, okay. Yeah, thought it was a little longer, but no. Okay, so let me go here. And I'll put the song over here. Okay, this is for the next class. And our first link over here about English only movement. Okay, so people, if you have any questions for me, just put them in the comment box or send me an email. And if I haven't already, I will post that video about your exams, okay? So it's on a separate video. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, stay healthy, and see you next week. Bye.